Hi, folks, and welcome once again to an episode of the LexRex Institute podcast. We've got an exciting program planned for you guys today. Today, we're going to be learning once again about... That's right, the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet and Socialist Republics. And today, we're actually going to be taking a deep dive into their constitution. Both of them, actually, the 1924 Constitution and then the 1936 Constitution.
Well, yeah, there was one after that, but people don't care about it, so we're not going to talk about it.
No, because I guess the 36 one lasted up through Brezhnev, I think.
Yeah,
right?
so up until 1977, which at that point, you're practically at the end already. So,
right. I mean, you leave out the whole Reagan era that way, but you keep in most of the Cold War at least.
Yep.
So I guess, before we do that, we're going to give you a brief update about one of the big cases we've been working on. But let's play our intro, and then we can do that.
Look at these three words written larger than the rest, with a special pride never written before or since. Tall words proudly saying, "We the people."
Anyway, as you said, we've got some updates in one of the cases that we've been working on. And when I say we, I mean you. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a couple of our cases, actually. First one is, you may remember our lawsuit on behalf of those fifth grade girls from the Los Alamitos Unified School District who were sent to what was ostensibly a science camp, which turned out to be sort of an LGBTQ propaganda camp. We have two lawsuits on that one. One of them is sort of a Freedom of Information thing. It's a Public Records Act-based lawsuit. That one's going on. Got a hearing on that next week. But the other one was recently filed, and we recently opposed the district's demurrer on that. Their demurrer was totally baseless, in our opinion. That hearing on that's going to be next week, too, so we should have some more updates on that in the near future. But our big update is going to be on Kari Lake's case. So Kari Lake, of course, the Republican candidate for governor of Arizona, who was recently, at least in terms of the official turnout, was defeated by Katie Hobbs, who was Secretary of State, as we know, person charged with administering elections. And lo and behold, there were tons of electoral irregularities, problems with compliance with state law. That went up on appeal all the way to the Arizona Supreme Court. And just last week, so last Wednesday, what day was that? That would have been March 22nd. We got a ruling from the Supreme Court saying that Kari Lake does have a right to have her case heard at trial, that they cannot rule against her on the basis of laches, and that basically examining whether or not the signature verification procedures they implemented were defective as a matter of law. Significantly, those are exactly the two issues the LexRex Institute briefed in this case. So we won on all of the issues that we briefed and won on none of the issues that we didn't. So I think it's safe to say that our amicus brief was fairly influential in that case. That's kind of a huge victory.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest victory on an election challenge that's been had in recent years. So, some of the reporting on this has said that, Kari Lake loses on most of her issues. Yeah, but it kept the signature verification issue live. The Arizona election has seriously been thrown up in the air as a result of this ruling. They may be getting a new election in the next few months. At least that's our hope. That's what we're going to be fighting for at the trial court level.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can't remember now offhand if it was the New York Times or the New Yorker, but the headline I saw the day following was Kari Lake loses, basically, and then it tucked away one paragraph about how, she will get a trial date for some of the issues. But
oh, by the way, there's a specific instruction saying the judge can't reject it for the reason that he did last time, and that he has to consider the signature verification claim as a matter of law. Basically, at this point, all we have to do is show that more ballots were affected by defects in signature verification than the margin of victory. Well, about 300,000 people submitted mail-in ballots on Election Day alone, all of which are subject to signature verification in Maricopa County. The margin of victory was 17,000. It's going to be fairly easy for us to show.
Yeah, that is a lot of mail-in ballots.
That's because the part of this election that's left out is because if you followed any news on this election, you probably heard about the long lines on Election Day. People having to wait 3-4 hours to vote. And sort of the spin on that most groups have taken is, well, they didn't want to wait in line, so they went home. Yeah, well, a lot of those folks went home, filled out their mail-in ballot, came back in, and dropped it off. So our point is that the other defects in electoral procedure actually inflated the turnout of these mail-in ballots, which then inflated the problems caused by signature verification irregularities.
Yep. So,
and there's very good reason for those safeguards, because if you were somebody who was looking to corrupt an election through mail-in ballots, which we know that's something that some people may have an interest in doing. Elections are fairly important. We don't have any evidence to show that happened here, but certainly it's something that could happen.
Yeah.
If you were going to do that, an inflated turnout of mail-in ballots would be a huge boon to you, because it would allow you to disguise the fact that you'd inflated those numbers artificially.
Yeah. So anyway, we will, I'm sure, have something else to say about that case in the future, but yeah,
so that's exciting. We worked with Ryan Heath of Heath Law PLLC over in Arizona on that. I was working on a pro hoc vice basis, but I do want to give a shout out to him. He did a lot of good work on that too.
Yep, thank you, Ryan. Anyway, anything else you want to say about that, or should we get into the?
No, I think that pretty much wraps it up.
The Soviet constitutions.
Yeah, so a place where you couldn't challenge election outcomes, because that's a liberty that we take for granted, right?
Yeah.
That we can challenge the stuff our government does. So let's look at a system where that might be a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I would say fewer avenues.
You were saying something, David.
I've forgotten, and this is maybe this is peeling back the curtain a little bit, but I will note that
the Iron Curtain.
No, the sort of the movie magic curtain, or I guess podcast magic curtain. We've had some back and forth about the volume of the Soviet national anthem as it shows up in the final cut, and I just want to observe that. I don't know how it sounds on your end, but on my end, it's basically deafening when you play that. So,
yeah, no, it is, but it's a separate track, David. You can
no. Granted, but it makes it seem like you're doing it specifically just to bother me.
That's just the way the program does it. For whatever reason, the audio is incredibly loud.
Anyway, before
rest in peace, headphone wearers.
Yeah, before we get into the specifics, and we're gonna start with the 1924 Constitution, sometimes called the Lenin Constitution. We will then do the 1936 one, or the Stalin Constitution. But I just want to ask you, because you read these more recently than I did. What was your
back to back? By the way, David, this is a lot of reading in preparation for the podcast. Usually, it's stuff I've already read. This is the 1936 Constitution. This is in 12-point font, 36 pages, 34 pages.
Yeah, it's not nothing. But
and that's the second. This one's about half as long. The first one that we read, but I think this one's kind of a reasonable length for a constitution. The 1924 one was about 4,000 words. Which is about the same as the U.S. Constitution, pre-amendment.
But
and
sorry, go ahead.
This one I think was like 8,000 or something. I mean, this is just ridiculous.
Something like that, yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to start with what was your experience reading these documents? How did it strike you?
I don't like them, David. I don't like them at all. I I thought I disliked those French constitutions we did last summer. Which, if you haven't listened to that, check out that episode. It's a good one. But, the one consolation with this 1924 Constitution was that it didn't just go on with endless platitudes about how important liberty is, or how important, I guess they wouldn't think that in the Soviet Union, but how important the rights of the worker are, how important it is to suppress the kulak and keep down the bourgeoisie and so on and so forth. It's the goal of this government is to make sure that everybody is protected and the private property is fairly administered. You don't get a lot of that in the one that Lenin Did he write it, or was he just involved?
I'm not actually sure about the personal authorship of either of them, but I think,
And his direction, at the very least.
Safe to say that he definitely had his hands in it in some way or other.
Yeah. Well, you don't get a lot of that in Lenin's Constitution, to its great credit. Lo and behold, I turn to this 1936 one.
Yeah.
And what do I find? The very beginning, first page of the 1936 Constitution. It does exactly that. It starts going on about how the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is a socialist state of workers and peasants. And then it goes on, it's the land deposits, waters, forests, mills are all to be run for the interests of the people. Mm-hmm. Everything is to be owned collectively. The people are to rule this system. And then goes on to talk about, when you get to the actual structure, about how that is not the case at all. But the people don't seem terribly involved. But, I didn't enjoy it, to answer your question, David. I didn't think they were very good.
Yeah. It may surprise you to hear that I agree with you about that. I did not find this enjoyable reading.
It's almost like we get our comeuppance from when we criticized the French one, because my criticism of probably my single biggest criticism of both of those French constitutions is structure was basically nowhere to be seen, right? I mean, they said, like, here's a legislative body. I guess it legislates. C'est la vie, whatever. We're French. We don't have to think that through too much. Well, the Ruskies, they're not like that. This is nothing but structure. And
just what a structure.
Just
committees within committees, bodies within bodies.
The bureaucratic apparatus is built into the constitutional structure.
We'll talk about that later. But that was one of my favorite sections is where the U.S. Constitution basically says the president can form a cabinet.
This lists the cabinet departments.
Yeah. That's a matter of fundamental law in the Soviet system.
Yeah, do we want to read that list? I don't know. Do we want to go through these point by point? I think we ought to, at least for a bit.
Point by point.
Here we go. Here's the different cabinet. I didn't let you answer the question.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
So here's the commissioner. So the first one is the president of the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR. So that's effectively the president of the commissars. And the different vice presidents, the different commissioners are commissioners of the people for foreign affairs, commissioner of the people for the military and naval affairs, commissioner of the people for foreign commerce, commissioner of the people for ways of communication, commissioner of the people for postal and telegraphic service, commissioner of the people for the inspection of workers and peasants, the president of the Supreme Council of National Economy, the commissioner of the people for labor, the commissioner of the people for finances, the commissioner of the people for supplies.
Yeah.
So there's like 5 different ones that are just economics and like 3 different ones that are war and nothing
Pretty
else.
much, yeah.
Yeah, originally we had state, the treasury, and war.
Yeah,
we got a lot more now.
That's true, but at least we don't make it a matter of constitutional importance that we have exactly those ones and no other ones.
Yeah, I mean.
Anyway, but
labor, finances, and supplies are all separate from each other.
Anyway, let's rewind a little bit though, because that's later on in the Constitution. Let's get back to the beginning.
Sure.
And I'm not sure we're going to be able to go through this.
So this is the 1924 Constitution. Context: this is like right when Lenin. Well, not right when Lenin took power. This is actually like a year before Lenin dies.
Yeah. But there's this whole period we sort of alluded very briefly in the last episode to the start of the Russian Civil War. During sort of the hottest parts of the fighting, the communists don't bother really establishing a constitution. They have a sort of provisional thing that they're partway working with. But 1924, now, they...
Well, and you can see why they were putting off writing it, because they were not very good.
That's fair. It turns out, in many ways, they weren't great at fighting the Civil War either, although they did win in the end. But they're much worse at writing a constitution, as it turns out. So,
yeah. And if you don't know how to govern, the best way of dealing with that is to have committees nested within committees.
Yeah. So
That's not true. That's like the worst way of dealing with it.
Yeah. I guess probably the first thing to note, though, about the actual structure, as far as it goes, is that in theory, the Soviet Union, like the United States, is supposed to be a federation. You have...
Yeah.
We often...
The difference is this says in its preamble, unite themselves into one federal state. We don't have that. We have 50 sovereign states.
And, as we tend to just use Soviet Union and Russia or communist Russia interchangeably. That's not technically true.
That's because they account for 51% of the electoral power.
Yeah. And,
a vote of Russia always overrides everybody.
Pretty much. And in sort of de facto, like actual calling the shots, they basically have 100% of the power.
Well, 51% will do that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you control 51% of a company's stock, you own the company.
Yeah. And well, on paper, they have a slight balance to that because they do have a bicameral legislature. So they have the one that's proportionate to population, and then they have the other one that's, per subunit, of which, Russia is only one. But
yeah, so let's David can vouch for me on this, but reading these constitutions, it's very difficult to know what their actual organs of government are.
Yes, absolutely.
They will introduce something, describe all of the things that it does, and then 30 articles later explain that was the legislative body for the system.
And the other thing that complicates this too, and this drove me crazy, I'm not sure how you felt about it, is that they sometimes switch back and forth between using an acronym for something and like actually using the name of it.
Constantly.
So like, and in some instances they use the acronym first. So it says something like the CEC, and then you find out later that stands for Central Executive Committee, and then later than that you find out what the Central Executive Committee is.
So here's what our Constitution does. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives.
Yeah.
Here's the Soviet Constitution. Chapter 1, Article 1. The Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, through its supreme organs, has the following powers. And then it lists all the powers of the central government, of which there are 24.
Yeah. And
there's 13 powers of Congress in our Constitution.
Yeah, it's worth noting, too, it's not clear to me what power isn't assigned to the center in this Constitution. There's a lot going on here. Control of the national economy, control of the military, civil and criminal legislation, education,
all foreign policy,
hygiene, which I think that probably includes like medical stuff.
Whether or not you have to brush your teeth.
Yeah, hygiene is one of the things. Use of land.
All laws regarding work.
Yeah. It's just
all laws regarding public instruction.
Yeah.
So education is centrally controlled. There's no facet of life that isn't touched by this. But just in case you were worried, the sovereignty of the member republics is limited only in the matters indicated in the present Constitution as coming within the competence of the Union. Outside of these limits, each member of the republic exerts its public powers independently. The USSR protects the rights of member republics. What rights?
It's not clear to me whatsoever what is left up to these member republics.
So the closest analog to this section in our Constitution would be Article 1, Section 8, which lists the powers of Congress. That's immediately followed by Article 1, Section 9, which lists limitations on the powers of Congress. And there are more limitations than there are powers.
And
this doesn't have any limitations other than if we didn't list it here, the member republics can do it.
Yeah. And we've talked before.
But if you include things like hygiene and laws regarding work, it doesn't even say interstate work. It's just work.
Right. Exactly. And I was going to say, we've talked probably ad nauseum at this point about how slippery some people choose to interpret the term commerce in our context. But bearing in mind that this is a Marxist state, the word economy almost literally means everything.
Is everything.
So, and
here we've got Article 1G, to direct commerce with foreign countries and to direct the system of internal commerce. It's funny because you can tell they actually read the U.S. Constitution when they were writing this. Because it's like, no, we're going to reject that interstate commerce part. Just direct internal commerce. That's how we're going to put it.
Yeah, but it's just, I can't imagine what wouldn't be under central control.
To define the domains of industry and industrial enterprises that are of federal interest.
Yeah.
So to decide which facets of the economy are of federal interest, and then to conclude treaties of concession, both federal and in the name of member republics. So to make labor agreements.
Yeah.
That's why that guy got to see Stalin after he made the densest steel, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's Article 1. Article 1, Section, I lost
I think he's a G.
H,
oh,
Section
H,
okay. He gets to see Stalin when he makes the densest
Although
steel.
bear in mind, this, And
then get dating advice from Stalin.
That would have been under the next constitution, to be fair, technically. But
yeah, actually, I don't think that is a power. I don't think there's a power of the central government to give dating advice.
No, I don't think so.
There's something that's
unless you count that as economics, because you might want to.
You could also count it as hygiene.
Yeah, you need to shower before you date, so it's hygiene. And you might.
Or they could be worried about like venereal disease and stuff. That's been used as a pretense to regulate that stuff before, even in America. So.
And, you might want to give your girlfriend flowers or something. That's both agriculture, use of land, and economics. So.
Oh, and it's certainly commerce, certainly internal commerce when you bought those. Unless you didn't. Well, I guess you could have otherwise sold those flowers on the open market.
Yeah.
So even if you didn't buy them. Okay, so it has power over basically everything. That's more important than knowing which organs exercise that power.
Clearly. And, this was my first thought. Chapter 2 of this Constitution, goes out of its way to say, oh, but don't worry, member republics are allowed to freely withdraw. My question is,
it's just in case that last section you read was a little bit frightening, and for those of you whose eyebrows are now raised, you've got the freedom to withdraw.
My question is, you've already told us that you control all the money and all the guns. So how free is that freedom really? That's
well, and that's the point that we really made with our series on the French Constitution, and I think it's apropos again here. Simply saying stuff does not make it so.
Yeah.
You protect liberties and freedoms with structural safeguards. If there is nothing in place ensuring that member republics are able to leave unencumbered, they will not be able to do so, especially if they're economically productive members. Okay, so Chapter 3. Supreme organ of power of the USSR is the Congress of Soviets. Thank you. You've been using that phrase a lot, so I'm glad that you've now defined it. And in the what does this even mean? In the recesses of the Congress of Soviets, the Central Executive Committee of the USSR, which is composed of the Federal Soviet and the Soviet of Nationalities. Okay, so a lot of undefined terms in this section. We've got the supreme organ of the USSR is the Congress of Soviets. So Congress of Soviets, and I think it probably means here the Congress of Soviets of the Soviet Union, right? Because those are different things. So keep that in mind. Congress of Soviets and then Congress of Soviets of the Soviet Union. And then in the recesses of the Congress of Soviets, you got the Central Executive Committee, or the CEC is probably what we'll call it. It's what this calls it some of the time, but not all of the time. And that is composed of the Federal Soviet and the Soviet of Nationalities. So we've got 4 different kinds of Soviets at this point. We've got the Congress of Soviets of the USSR, which isn't always called that. You have to infer from context. And then within that, Central Executive Committee, which is composed of a Federal Soviet and a Soviet of Nationalities. So what is each of those, David, and how did you figure it out?
With some outside help, for sure, because this is not very intuitive, I would say. But
you probably could figure it out internally, but there'd be a lot of page flipping back and forth.
But so as we've mentioned before in previous episodes, a Soviet is just a council. And, the Soviet Union, unsurprisingly, is littered with them. There's Soviets everywhere.
It is a union of Soviets. Yeah, and they're organized all the way from the top, the Central Committee, all the way down to the very bottom. where, you know, you may have a Soviet for your particular factory that gets together and decides how the factory is run, but is also accountable to the orders delivered to it from the city's Soviet, which is accountable to the county's county's Soviet, which is accountable to maybe the Republic Soviet, you know, up the chain of being.
You know, in their case, it's probably like administrative division and oblast and, you know, whatever, you know, other weird terms they've got. Other languages are strange.
So as God is to Aristotle, so is the Central Committee to the
I'm sure that's going to help so many of our listeners.
Well, it's the top of the chain of being, right? It's the full effluvity of being, or whatever it's called.
Anyway, so, but the main thing I think that's important here is that, like, the people who end up in the CEC, which is sort of the equivalent of Congress.
Central Executive Committee, yep.
Those are picked by, like...
So the Congress is not equivalent to Congress. The Executive Committee, so presumably the executive, is going to be equivalent to Congress.
Except that there's not a real distinction between legislative and executive.
There's a real muddy line between an executive and a legislature in this Constitution. The 1936 Constitution, to its credit, does clarify.
Yes, it does. But anyway, so basically you have the Soviets from all of the member republics come together. That's one of those Congress terms that I've already forgotten. But like when you have all of them together, that's one of those things.
That is the Congress of Soviets, but not the Congress of Soviets of the Soviet Union. When they get together, the delegates they appoint comprise the Congress of Soviets of the Soviet Union.
You know, so then the two subsidiary bodies of the CEC, or Central Executive Committee, one is based on population and the other is based on representing subunits, those member republics. So it's roughly, you know, modeled on something like the House of Reps and the Senate. It's the same sort of idea.
At least in terms of representation. Yeah, and we get to that next. Mm-hmm. So that's, by the way, I'm sure that every single person listening to this is saying, I don't understand anything you just explained. That's okay. We're going to try to make it clear despite not knowing the basic structure, because I don't think that they knew the basic structure, which is kind of how it...
as it'll turn out, most of this structure doesn't really matter, because for most of the time, a very small number of people are actually in command of everything.
Yeah, like one guy, whether it's Lenin or Stalin.
Yes.
Okay, so the Congress of Soviets of the USSR is composed of representatives of the urban Soviets and of the Soviets of the urban type on the basis of one deputy per 25,000 electors.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, in the U.S. Constitution, it's got to be at least 35,000. It's not just urban, it's everybody. But this goes on to say, and the representatives of the Congress of Soviets of the rural districts on the basis of one deputy per 125,000 inhabitants.
Yeah. So if you live in a city, you get 5 times more representation per person than if you live out in the sticks. So that's cool.
Which, interestingly, is the way that many people you talk to want to revise our Constitution to work. You know, people who say they want to get rid of the Electoral College and have just a national popular vote, that's essentially what they're calling for, is greater urban representation, because the population centers are always going to have more people.
Yeah. So, you know, that's...
You know, they're borrowing an element from the worst Constitution ever.
So there's that. That's the one sort of parallel. The other thing that people tend to complain about in the U.S. about our system is that the Senate, you know, disproportionately represents certain people. What's funny is that it's that problem, if you see that as a problem, is even worse under this Constitution, because, as we mentioned, the Russian part of the Soviet Union was more than half the population. And
California, however big it may be, is not even close to half the population.
It's like, what, 15, 18%, something like that? Somewhere in that zone. Anyway.
You know, I looked up just who was in each time zone at one point, and the Pacific time zone is like 11% of the population. It's really small.
Yeah.
Like, or even smaller than Central.
Yeah.
So no, we can't be that big a proportion.
No, it's, California, easily the most populous state, but it also takes up roughly 2/3 of the West Coast versus, the East Coast has
Right.
dozens of states in that same space. So anyway, it's
Because Russia's not big.
it's really the worst of all worlds that you're getting as far as the representation mechanics go.
Yeah, the representation's just a mess. So it's a good thing that they won't be deciding a lot. Because the Central Executive Committee can simply adjourn the Congress of Soviets due to what it deems extraordinary circumstances. Gee, I wonder if that'll ever happen.
I think this is...
I wonder if this fledgling country that has just been created from nothing will ever have extraordinary circumstances.
And that just emerged from, six
Yeah,
years
Global
of civil war after 4 years of World War One. Yeah. I feel like I can say this as a general rule of thumb that I think we've learned at this point from the Articles of Confederation in the French Constitution and now this one. One thing to pay attention to is whether your founding document talks a lot about extraordinary circumstances or emergency powers. Because if it does, that's probably an indication that someone's already scheming to use them.
Well, and that really was, if there was a central takeaway from our series about the Roman Republic and its fall into empire, that was it. It was that the Roman Constitution made specific provision for extraordinary circumstances, and that literally was its downfall.
Yep.
So any student of history, any student of republics, governments organized in this fashion, should understand full well that you don't want to include provisions about emergency.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about the Weimar Republic, but...
Yeah, maybe we'll get to that one of these days. But the reason you don't want to do that is there are going to be emergencies, and people are going to abuse their powers during emergencies. You don't want to put a legal stamp of validity on it when they do that. You want that to be an extra legal exercise of power, and you want people fighting against it because you always want the government to stay within certain bounds, or it's just going to go out of control, which is exactly what happens in the Soviet Union and exactly what happened in Rome or anywhere they've ever done that. France,
Germany,
I think Weimar Republic's probably the very best example of that because you know who came out of that one?
Yeah, an Austrian guy.
Yeah, with a funny little mustache.
Anyway.
So not that we're comparing, I guess we are comparing them to Hitler. Yeah, never mind.
we are pretty directly, yes.
Yeah. We actually should do a series on that one because I think that's the kind of constitution that most people that dislike ours would look at and say, yeah, we should have one like that. Ooh, yeah, but that one gets you Hitler.
Yes, it does.
Big swing and a miss. Okay. So a couple more things from chapter 3. So as we just mentioned, the Central Committee can dismiss the Congress whenever it wants to, as long as it's deemed an emergency to be in effect. Not that that really matters, though, because the Executive Committee of the Union is convoked only once yearly.
Yeah. So this is, we talked about the idea of committees within committees. This is where it gets real bad. Because it turns out that as much as the title Central Executive Committee sounds like it should be your primary executive, it isn't.
That's reserved to the Presidium.
Yep.
Which is another arm of the Central Executive Committee. They meet all the time.
They're permanent.
But the actual committee itself, this one that has any kind of representative features to it, only meets once a year. So if this is your main legislative body and it has to pass off all laws that are created during that year in this one meeting, what is it, a week long, something like that?
Yeah, I know that under the Stalin years, traditionally they got together for 2 weeks, 2 weeks out of the year. I'm not quite sure.
So in 2 weeks, you got to look over every law that's been proposed for the Soviet Union, which is basically all of your laws, because everything is a power retained by the federal government and nothing is retained by the republics. I think they're going to be voting on a lot of omnibus bills. What do you think?
Most
David?
likely, yeah. I think.
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be a line item thing. I think it's going to be like, do you want to approve the new directives for detaining enemies of the state, along with the new agricultural quotas, along with this treaty with France?
Yeah.
You get a yes or no vote on that whole thing.
And I think probably the answer is going to be yes.
I think the vote's usually going to be yes. Yeah, I think it's going to be yes, because that's my suspicion as well. Okay, so... Oh, and I guess just one brief point. How does this work in the United States Constitution? Who decides when Congress is going to meet, how often Congress is going to meet, and for how long Congress is going to meet? You have any idea, David?
I believe the answer is Congress does that.
Congress decides that. That's right. So it's not decided by a branch of government that is specifically vying against Congress for power.
It's interesting because, I think you were right earlier when you said that it seems pretty evident they had read the U.S. Constitution. I'm curious.
But did they understand the U.S. Constitution?
I'm curious if they...
It's actually better than most of our members of Congress who haven't even read it. So I'll give them credit for that.
I am curious, though, just because thinking about this part in particular, if they read any of the sort of the background, because I think we very deliberately vested Congress with that power because we remembered the English Civil War, where the problem was the king keeps dismissing Parliament and they can't get anything done. And it seems like the Soviets were like, if they did look into that, they must have decided that sounded pretty good.
No, I think they decided, it's really bad for a king to dismiss Parliament. But if a smaller executive committee appointed by a subset of the members of Parliament were to dismiss Parliament, that would be fine.
You're probably right there. Yeah, that's fair.
Fundamentally different, David.
Because we have like 6 guys with unlimited power, not just one.
Right. But practically speaking, it's one. Okay, so now we're going to look at I think we just looked at chapter 3. Chapter 4 is next.
Yeah.
So this is where the Presidium is actually introduced for the first time. We kind of jumped ahead of ourselves a bit in talking about what they do.
Did, yeah, but... Oh boy, is this, this is where my eyes definitely started to glaze over a little bit when I was reading this document.
Oh, you didn't catch Article 16?
Article 16. No, I did. Did.
Yeah, so what that one says is the Federal Soviet and the Soviet of Nationalities. So those are the 2 divisions of the CEC. Mm-hmm. I know it doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. Examine all decrees, codes, and acts that are presented to them by the Presidium of the CEC and by the Council of the People's Commissars of the USSR, by the different commissars of the people of the Union, and by the CEC of the member of the republics, as well as those that owe their origin to the Federal Soviet and the Soviet of Nationalities. So that's the extent to which they're a legislative body.
Yeah. And
they examine the laws that are brought to them that have already been made by other people, whether it's by the Presidium or by all those cabinet secretaries working in Congress that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and I assume that this is meant to work the way you stated, basically, that here's all the stuff, yay or nay, but it doesn't even actually
put a stamp on it.
It doesn't actually even say that, though. It actually...
Yeah, I think because they didn't want themselves to be bound to the decision of whatever if they actually did exercise their power, they didn't want it to be advisory.
Yeah, this reminded me of one of the... I don't think this ever made it into one of the French constitutions that actually was put into effect, but one of the plans, I think we talked about this, had a tricameral structure where there was going to be one house that drafted legislation, another house that received that draft and debated it, and then a third house read the transcript of the debate and voted on whether they should approve the legislation.
That's a garbage system.
But this one is oddly kind of similar to that. One group, or actually 2 groups, if the Presidium and the Commissars draft everything, and then you just give it to somebody else and they look at it.
Yeah. And here we get an explicit Article 26, makes it explicit between sessions of the CEC and of the USSR. That's the Central Executive Committee. The supreme organ of power is the Presidium of the USSR, constituted by the CEC to the extent of 21 members, including the Presidium of Federal Soviet and the Presidium of the Soviet of Nationalities. So finally, like 12 articles later, we get a definition of what the Presidium does. That's going to be your de facto power most of the time in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, because as I think we mentioned already, it is the only one of these bodies that we've talked about so far that is actually permanently in session. Everything else gets called and dismissed, in fact, by these people if they want to. But they're permanent.
Look at this garbage. Article 23. In the case of disagreement between Federal Soviet and the Soviet of Nationalities, the question is transmitted to a compromise committee chosen by the two of them.
Yeah. So sometimes you actually, that's interesting. You actually do sometimes end up with a tricameral structure here. If the two houses can't agree, they'll make a third house.
Generally, that'd be the function of the executive, but considering everybody is both executive and legislative, I guess we
just
can't
need to make a new committee whenever we need it.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
In any sane system, in fact, I want to draw your attention to this. The entire point of bicameralism is that both houses have to agree on something for it to become law. You don't do anything in the event of their disagreement. The law just doesn't become a law.
Yep.
Why bother being bicameral if you just appoint a third? What a waste.
Yeah. It does seem like they were trying to crib from other systems. Like they were like, oh, that seemed like a good idea there, but they just didn't understand the point of any of it.
Okay, I think we can probably turn to the Supreme Court at this point.
So we're jumping over basically just more stuff that just gets more and more granular about how each of these stupid committees works.
Just further concentrating power into the hands of the Presidium, basically.
Yeah.
It is almost dizzying in its scale. But so we'll skip to the Supreme Court. They do have one. And what does it do? Well, some of this is plagiarized from the U.S. Constitution because it does things like gives the authentic interpretations of questions of federal legislation. I would never put it that way in our constitutional context, but I think that's basically the power of judicial review as they understand it. Examines on request of the prosecutor of the Supreme Court of the USSR the decrees, decisions, and verdicts of the Supreme Courts of the member republics. So in other words, basically their attorney general or prosecutor general decides when he doesn't like what a member republic has done and says, review this question, Supreme Court. That is a sort of heavy-handed, because a lot of times, so generally if the attorney general supports a petition for cert before the U.S. Supreme Court will usually grant cert on that case because they know the federal government has a substantial stake in it. It's not enshrined in our Constitution, nor should it be, but that is generally how it works. To render decisions on the request of the CEC of the USSR as to the constitutionality of laws passed by the member republics. So similar thing, except for now Congress can ask them to review laws. So they have jurisdiction over anything brought to them by any arm of the federal government, essentially.
You know, you want to streamline the process of imposing federal rule on anyone who dare disagree.
Right. Settle legal disputes between member republics. I'm fine with that one. No complaints there. And to examine the, here's the one, this is the
my
big
favorite one.
To examine the accusations brought before it of high officials against whom charges have been made relative to the performance of their duties. Any charge against a high official is brought before the Supreme Court.
Yep.
And it's not that they violated the law.
Yep.
It's that they haven't discharged their duty properly. It's the official organ for show trials. It's in their constitution. If you want a show trial, they're the one that does it.
For those of you who are even remotely familiar with Soviet history, I think you can guess this is probably going to be one of the more prominent uses of this Supreme Court.
There's not even any way you can argue against this. Like, there's no argument they don't have jurisdiction. If your client, I guess did they even have lawyers in their system? I guess they did.
Yeah, but like, would everyone be either like a district attorney or a public defender? I guess, right? Like that would be,
I guess,
how that would work.
But like, imagine that you represent one of these high officials that's charged with not a crime. I'm sorry, I almost said crime. Charged with not doing his job properly. You can't even argue jurisdiction here. They just have it.
And it's also, frankly, it's probably not going to be in your interest to mount an effective defense of your client in that case.
You should probably just hang your head in shame and throw yourself up on the climate
Yeah,
court.
I think that's the only remotely prudent thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Here, Article 47, the right to submit questions referred to in Article 43, so that's the one that we just read, talking about the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, to the Supreme Court of the USSR for examination belongs exclusively to the CEC of the USSR, to its Presidium, to the prosecutor of the Supreme Courts of the member republics, and to the unified political administration of the state of the USSR. In other words, nothing can go before the Supreme Court unless the empowered entities in the federal government say that it can. There is no right to redress for grievances against the federal government whatsoever. Not there. That's spelled out in their constitution. You cannot complain about what the feds do to you.
You know, I guess in theory they could agree, well, we shouldn't have done that to you. So, well, yes, we'll let you bring that to the court. But
okay, you can play devil's advocate. You can compare this to our 11th Amendment, which basically says that state, you can't sue a state without that state's consent. But what do we do in America? We just sue the officer of that state. You know, I sue Gavin Newsom instead of suing California. You really think that Gavin Newsom's going to consent to me suing him? The way this is phrased, he has to do that.
Yeah,
it's not like
I don't think anyone is ever going to actually do that. But you know, on paper.
All right. So, anything else we want to cover in this one, or should we turn to 1936 now?
We already skipped ahead a little bit to the People's Commissars thing, but I just I think it bears noting, though, as much as we've complained on this show about how our executive agencies functionally make law, this Constitution literally empowers their equivalent of that, the People's Commissars, to actually draft legislation. So that's fun.
And isn't that like an arm of the NKVD or something?
That was that unified public administration thing, which that one. Yeah. The section on that in the actual Constitution is so unclear to me. It basically just says like we need to suppress counter-revolutionary tendencies or whatever. So we need a unified political administration. I didn't understand exactly what that was trying to say, other than reading between the lines. Actually, the Communist Party is just going to run everything, which is functionally what that does. But yeah, so I looked into it, and yeah, it was an arm of the NKVD, which later became the KGB. It is like the state.
That's the secret police.
The state security apparatus, or in other words, yes, the secret police. So, that's in their constitution. Is that basically every?
Is that if this Byzantine structure that we threw out here doesn't work? Don't worry, the secret police is actually in control.
Because it mentions like.
Oh, I wasn't worried at all.
It says like basically each level of the government down to like municipalities is going to have like this like adjunct member of this unified political administration, which basically just means that there's going to be a Fed watching everyone do everything all the time.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I guess it's good they told you about it. We didn't do that here, right? When the NSA was doing that, they didn't tell anybody.
And then sorry,
Edward Snowden published those documents.
Yeah, sorry. Last note on this one before we go to the Stalin Constitution. In Chapter 10 of this one.
So does Stalin fix it? Sorry, go
ahead. In a weird way to some extent, but more importantly, no, he doesn't fix it. But last note on this one. Chapter 10 of the 1924 Constitution also spells out all of the commissars, so again, basically executive departments, that the member republics have to have. So it says, though the U.S. Constitution...
That's right. They picked the cabinet for each of the member republics.
So it's as if our Constitution fantastic. Says, like, oh yeah, each state has to have a department of water and power, a department, like all this stuff.
You know what our Constitution has to say on that?
I think nothing, if I'm not mistaken.
That each state government will have a Republican form of government.
Fair enough.
Full stop.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
but it does not spell what the
here. There's actually specific. There's provisions saying they have to bring their government into line with the provisions of this Constitution.
Yeah. So, and again, at this point, why have a federation if you're going to make every member of the federation do things exactly the same way?
Because they can leave if they want to.
Yeah.
It's purely voluntary.
Once they've given up all of their money for years and ceded all military control to the center.
All right, so now let's look at this behemoth document of a constitution. This is Stalin's improvements to Lenin's constitution. I do want to give Papa Stalin credit where it's due. I think he actually does improve on it in certain regards. This is much clearer.
Yeah.
It
was at least easier to follow, and it gave less of an impression of having been drafted in committee and then just approved out the door.
We now have things like right at the top, I guess right after the series of platitudes that they're not going to do. When you get into the actual structure of it, we have the jurisdiction of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is represented by its highest organs of state and organs of authority, covers, and then it describes the jurisdiction that it has. And then it jumps straight into the sovereignty of the Union of Republics is limited only within the provisions set forth in Article 14 of the Constitution of the USSR. This is like many pages later after we list all the different republics. I'm sorry, Article 32. The legislative power of the USSR is exercised exclusively by the Supreme Soviet of the USSR.
Yeah.
There we have it, the legislative power.
Clear.
And the next article. The Supreme Soviet of the USSR consists of two chambers, the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities, right up at the top, right where you want it. Way to go, Stalin. I think you could have done better on that not murdering 70 million people thing, but it's, as far as having a clearer constitution, got to give him credit.
Yeah, gold star, at least as far as that goes.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
Fair enough. It's because it's really not that hard of a task to just think I should probably explain what my terms mean before I use them.
Yeah.
But historically, as we've seen, very few people actually do manage to pass that hurdle.
Most of the stuff in this Constitution is the same as in the 1924 Constitution. So we're going to talk about the differences at this point. So one of the differences is, well, here, all the different republics are actually noted.
Yeah.
So, David.
Do you want me to read them? Because there's a lot.
No, I thought you had something to say about that. That's in your notes.
I do, yeah. What's interesting is it doesn't just say like, oh, it's the Russian Republic and the Ukrainian Republic. It actually names the sort of administrative divisions of each of them, as though in the U.S. Constitution it said these are all the states and these are all their counties, which that's fun because that adds probably. They
have to keep them that way forever. Yeah. There's the solution to gerrymandering, David. We're always talking. There's no great solution to gerrymandering. It turns out that Papa Stalin figured it out. You just tell them what all of their different municipal divisions are going to be.
I have to say
they have the power to relocate people, so it doesn't even fix it. I mean, they can't draw new district lines, but each of these republics could just say, we're going to move all the people that vote one way into this apartment block here. It fixes nothing. And I don't know why I'm even pointing that out. Obviously, it fixes nothing.
It also adds probably like 10% of the length of the Constitution, which I know you were so happy about how long this one was.
It's great. And then do we want to just breeze over those introductory sections where it talks about how socialist property in the USSR exists either in the form of state property or in the form of cooperative and collective farm property?
Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on that because it is just has basically no practical meaning. But I think the one thing we should note is that
Article 3 for sure.
Which one's Article 3 again?
I just want to read this in full.
Go for it then.
Because I want you to see if this remains true. In the USSR, all power belongs to the working people of the town and country, as represented by the Soviets of the Working People's Deputies.
Not in a sense that I think most people would recognize. No, it doesn't. In the same way that we talked about, like the Rousseau's idea of the general will may not have anything to do with whether most people think something.
Whether people generally want it.
In that sense, if you define the people to be like Stalin, for instance, then yes. Otherwise, no. If you mean...
Well, it turns out that we do define it that way.
Yeah.
I want to look at Article 12 as well. In the USSR, work
Mhm.
is a duty and a matter of honor for every able-bodied citizen, in accordance with the principle, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. That's from the Bible.
Yeah, this was something I found interesting. And you actually did some research on this when I brought this up. But as far as I know, we were never able to get to the bottom of whether any of the people who talked about it knew it was from the Bible. But like all of the members of the Bolshevik in the Communist Party talked about this phrase. But yeah, that's from the New Testament actually, which it's interesting that it's in the Soviet Constitution.
Yeah, I think it's taken grossly out of
Yes,
context.
it is.
That kind of goes without saying, I feel. And then, the principle applied in the USSR is that of socialism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his work.
So we've got,
which is actually different from the Marx quotation.
Is it?
It was need in the Marx, each according to his need.
Oh, you're right. I don't think I actually even consciously read to the end of that sentence because I just assumed it was the same as.
You don't get what you need anymore. You get what you work for.
That's interesting. I did not notice that.
Although, don't worry. In their Bill of Rights, there's a right to get food and whatnot, even if you don't work.
We'll get to that later on.
It's the blatant contradiction.
The one thing I did want to note, though, just about all this sort of fluffy stuff at the beginning that, as we've said already, mostly doesn't have any actual concrete meaning. Probably the major problem of Stalin's administration, and I mean that from his perspective, because from everyone else's there were lots of problems, but from his point of view, the main problem he was trying to resolve was getting people to actually move to and stay on these collective farms that he had set up. So these like sort of massive agricultural combines. He tried to relocate all the peasants away from their homes and make them live in these sort of compounds, basically, and do all the farming. So there's a lot of mention of collective farms. There's a lot of mention of agriculture in this constitution. And the first major difference, if we're okay jumping to that as far as representation goes, is that he got rid of that disparity between urban and rural population being represented.
Yeah, we don't need it anymore. We've collectivized the rural population. Now they should be represented the same way as everybody else is, right? Yeah, so other changes. So we got rid of that. What else did we change?
This isn't really a change, but it is a difference, which I thought was worth pointing out. Chapter 2 of the Stalin Constitution, because the first one talked about the center having control over the national economy. This one goes out and spells out there is one budget centrally approved that decides how much money goes everywhere in the USSR, like down to village level.
Right.
So
a lot of this is just a clarification of things that were very muddy in the first one. So, in case there was any wiggle room in that one to think that there was some autonomous ability to direct budgets of different republics, we now know that's not true. Stalin gets to pick all of that.
Yeah. Oh, another one. This one I found very interesting. So we talked before about how, like, in theory, you've got the...
Guys, this is going to be Hayek's socialist calculation problem on steroids. I mean, they're not even figuring it out at the local level. It's all figured out nationally. Yeah,
which those of you...
Anyway, go ahead.
Those of you interested in the nitty-gritty of economics can look that up, the socialist calculation problem. But this one I found very interesting. So we talked before about how everything just sort of gets narrower and narrower. The CEC is a narrower circle of the general Soviets and so on and so forth. But now we talked about the Presidium is where the real sort of power is, because they're always, meeting.
Always in session.
Yeah. This constitution says that they're allowed to call, they can not just dismiss the Soviets, they can call for new elections, which normally...
Whenever they want.
Normally, in a parliamentary system like the UK, where I am currently, Parliament can basically dismiss the Prime Minister and call for a new election of the Prime Minister. This is basically the opposite. The Prime Minister can be like, you know what? No, you need to pick a new Parliament, basically.
There are fully 3 pages just listing the stuff the Presidium can veto and undo.
Yep.
I mean, we're very, very clear. Just in case it looked like any other arm of government had any power, no, it's the Presidium that gets to pick. It's the decider.
Yeah.
We clarify that thing about that committee that you form when the Congress of the Soviets can't agree with each other.
Yep.
It goes to a conciliation commission. So now we have a name for that. And if conciliation commission fails to arrive at an agreement, or if its decision fails to satisfy one of the chambers, the question is considered for a second time by the chambers. Failing agreement between the two chambers, the Presidium of the Soviet Union of the USSR dissolves the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and orders new elections. Yep. So you'd better agree. Or you're losing your job.
I'm jumping way ahead here, but chapter 8, again, like, much as it spelled out the subdivisions of each member republic, it says now how you need to organize local government down to levels, I assume, below a village. I'm not sure, these are Russian terms, but down to the level of stanitsas, villages, hamlets, kishlocks, and owls.
Even the kishlocks.
Yeah.
Even the kishlocks are centrally administered. Did you look at Article 78, the list of people's commissars in this one?
I didn't make notes of how it's different, but I did see that
there are more now.
Longer, yes.
Yeah, now we have the food industry, fishing industry, meat and dairy, produce industry, light industry, textile industry, timber industry, agricultural, state grain and livestock farms, finance, trade, internal affairs, state security, justice, public health, building materials industry, state control. Oh, it goes on.
I'm very curious. Does food industry mean like only restaurants? Because then there were like 3 or 4 other ones that were like food products.
It might mean like the final product.
Is this
so like meat would be the slaughterhouses and the ranches, but food would be like what they sell in the grocery store, like the ground beef.
It's very confusing. Building materials industry is an interesting one too.
Building materials.
Like you'd think you might just have sort of like a mineral or like raw goods kind of category, but like specifically one for like girders and concrete is very interesting.
And it's separate from the timber industry. Yeah. All right. So those are the commissariats. Yeah. Anything else you want to say about this one? I mean, I guess noteworthy in both of these is we tend to talk about both Lenin and Stalin and say that they are dictators. Neither of them ever abrogated these systems. And remarkably, as we obviously know, the power consolidated in Stalin's hands in the later years of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death. He never threw out this system. No. This is the same essential system that was in place under Lenin.
Yeah, there was no reason to throw it out because everyone knew no matter what it said on paper, and frankly, what it said on paper wasn't very good. This was never...
I think they followed what it said on paper.
And it was never going to be an impediment to one guy calling the shots. Like it's even if sort of like lower ranking people in this system wanted to, pursue their rights to the fullest, there's not very much they can do. And in point of fact, very few of them even tried because, there was always the very strong possibility that they could be arrested or killed.
Right.
But
no, really. I mean, it was not a small number that happened to. So here's the part they didn't follow. Chapter 10, fundamental rights and duties of citizens.
Yeah. We've talked before about, at least a couple of times about Scalia's comments on this Constitution where he said, if you're only interested in a Bill of Rights, the Soviet one sounds better than the American one.
They had a much better Bill of Rights than we do. Yeah, and actually play it right now.
But then I tell them, if you think that a Bill of Rights is what sets us apart, you're crazy. Every banana republic in the world has a Bill of Rights. Every president for life has a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights of the former evil empire, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was much better than ours. I mean it literally. It was much better. We guarantee freedom of speech and of the press. Big deal. They guaranteed freedom of the speech, of the press, of street demonstrations and protests, and anyone who is caught trying to suppress criticism of the government will be called to account. Whoa, that is wonderful stuff. Of course. just words on paper, what our framers would have called a parchment guarantee. And the reason is that the real constitution of the Soviet Union, you think of the word constitution, it doesn't mean a bill, it means structure. Say a person has a sound constitution, has a sound structure. The real constitution of the Soviet Union, which is what our framers debated that whole summer in Philadelphia in 1787. They didn't talk about the Bill of Rights. That was an afterthought, wasn't it? That constitution of the Soviet Union did not prevent the centralization of power in one person or in one party. And when that happens, the game is over. The Bill of Rights is just what our framers would call a parchment guarantee.
So that's a Scalia quote. So let's see what that much better Bill of Rights was.
Yeah.
Citizens of the USSR have the right to work, that is, are guaranteed the right to employment and payment for their work in accordance with its quantity and quality.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like FDR's improved Bill of Rights. Remember that?
Yeah, a little bit.
Citizens of the USSR have the right to rest and leisure. Citizens of the USSR have the right to maintenance in old age and also in case of sickness and loss of capacity to work. Citizens of the USSR have the right to education. Women in the USSR are accorded equal rights with men in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life. So it's not a patriarchy. You don't have to worry
Interesting
about
that the government is apparently in charge of social and cultural life in addition to everything else. But
yeah. Equality of rights of citizens in the USSR, irrespective of nationality or race.
Yep, sure.
I mean, this is just great. We got all kinds of equality. All the basic necessities of life are guaranteed to us. What could go wrong?
Even beyond that, freedom of conscience and of worship,
inviolability of the homes of citizens and privacy of correspondence are protected by law.
Yeah, maybe protected by law.
That goes a step further than ours. Ours says no warrants shall issue except on probable cause. You have a right to be secure in your persons, houses, papers, and effects. This goes further. The inviolability of the homes of citizens. Yep. So no one is ever going to break into your home in the middle of the night.
Yeah,
and send you to
put
a
bag
gulag.
over your head and send you off to a labor camp. Yep.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever going to censor your mail. That definitely never happened. Yeah, freedom of speech and of the press and of assembly, including the holding of mass meetings, freedom of street processions and demonstrations. I think this is one of the ones that Scalia specifically points out. Yeah, it's like they go into even greater detail. Like, the freedom of assembly is a constitutional right in the U.S., but like it doesn't say anything about specifically can you have a street procession, but here you can.
No, it's spelled out in detail exactly what you can do. Did that ever happen?
I think it did way after Stalin was dead and in the non-Russian parts of the USSR that were already like...
Ooh, are you talking about Prague Spring?
That's...
Because that didn't go so well, David.
No, and, I'm talking about like right before the USSR broke up. And I'm talking about...
Okay. Oh, the after the Glasnost.
Yeah, I'm talking about like Uzbekistan, not so much not so much Prague or Hungary or Poland, or any of the places.
Which, by the way, if you don't know how Prague Spring ended, it was in Russian tanks coming down the streets to suppress.
And what makes it even worse in that case is that technically, this is a complete fiction, but technically speaking, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, a lot of those Eastern Bloc states weren't actually even supposed to be considered to be part of the USSR. But as soon as they start considering a change in policy, USSR tanks are in the streets.
Well, see, David, that's the thing, is being a part of the USSR just gets you representation. They still have power over you whether or not you're a member.
I can't think of a better term than puppet government, but yeah, that's basically what they were.
So we're a little bit over time, so I think any concluding thoughts on the Soviet Constitution?
Just that I think we really didn't go into detail about why those guaranteed rights were laughable, but hopefully people know enough about the history to know that without us having to spell it out. But yeah.
I mean, if you don't know Gulag Archipelago, I think we should start offering that on our website.
Yeah, we talked about that last
let's do
time. So
that.
yeah, we should get that up there. Interestingly enough, the one about freedom of worship, we had a guest lecturer here at the University of Edinburgh just a couple weeks ago who was talking about the fact that the Soviets outlawed an entire church in the Ukraine during this period. So I guess not so much on the freedom of worship.
Well, David, that wasn't worship.
That's probably something else
that was,
you do in a church.
Yeah, that was religious assembly or something. That's not protected.
You have freedom of assembly and you have freedom of religion, but not together. Not
religious
combined.
assembly. No, it actually, I mean, it is a big deal that our Constitution does not protect freedom of worship.
Freedom
it
of
protects
religion.
the free exercise of
Yeah.
religion. Free
Yeah.
exercise of religion. You are free to do the things that your religion dictates.
Yeah.
That's not a freedom of conscience clause.
Anyway, all of this to say, there really is no substitute for making sure that your systems balance power, balance people's interests, and prevent, the accumulation of all state power into one body, which is what these constitutions explicitly do, and don't make any bones about it.
The fact that you don't call that guy a king
doesn't matter at all.
Doesn't make any difference in the end.
Yeah.
It's just the same thing. Monopolies are bad, right? Monopolies of anything are bad. Monopolies of the ability to exercise force against people are particularly bad. Unfortunately, I'm not a Rothbardian. Maybe we're going to lose our anarchist followers. I don't know if we have any of those, but I don't think that you can split up law enforcement and rule of law in the same jurisdiction. I think there does have to be a state that presides over it. And if there is a state, you need to make sure it's one that doesn't hand all of its power to one entity within that state. Our Constitution splits up those powers very, very effectively. And I think you said it after our French Constitution series. U.S. Constitution, except no imitators, really.
Yeah, and
especially not the Soviet Constitution. This is the worst.
And it's not the ultimate important factor, but we've talked about it before. It bears repeating. How many constitutions in history have lasted anywhere close to the amount of time the U.S. one has? And we have fights about it. People are divided in their opinion of it, but it keeps working. Like, we have stayed together.
Yeah.
We haven't.
And you can say like, oh, well, they don't follow it, so it's still in place, but it's just a parchment guarantee at this point. But that's not true. We still have two houses of Congress. We still elect them the way the Constitution calls for us to do that. We still have a president. We still elect him the way the Constitution calls for us to do that. We still have a Supreme Court that still exercises the same basic functions that are spelled out in the Constitution. Now, because we're very spoiled, and because fidelity to the Constitution matters, we will absolutely complain when it steps one toe out of line. But I want to put that in context when it happens. We will fight. Everybody at Lex Rex Institute will fight vigilantly and, often vehemently for a strict letter of the law adherence to that Constitution. But the degree of adherence to it is on a scale unparalleled in human history.
And the reason we want to fight for it is because we believe the system works. It's not just because we think they're nice ideas.
Yeah.
Anyway, do we have time for Captain Kangaroo? We have gone.
Yeah, let's do one of them. Why not? I will. Let's see. Where's our intro theme? There we go. Gather around, everybody, young and old, everybody who's interested in eccentricities of law throughout the world and throughout the ages. Welcome to Captain Kangaroo Court.
Anyway, all right. Since we're only going to do one, I'll share with you one of the things that ended up on the cutting floor from last time, where I presented you.
I thought we'd just do something in the Soviet Union. I guess it's too easy there.
Well, I didn't prepare for that either. But last time I had you sort of evaluate a number of different lawsuits that people brought. Here's one that ended up on the cutting floor. Texas man sues his date for texting during Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. What I like the most about this is that this guy,
For $17.31.
the price of the ticket, because he paid, he bought this person her ticket.
What is it? A theory of implied contract, or what's good? What's the basis of the lawsuit
I
here?
guess that's probably the underlying assumption here.
The contract was I would buy you a ticket, and your consideration paid to me was paying attention.
Seems that way, yeah. Shockingly, for avid readers of USA Today, they don't go into great detail on the actual legal issues. But
I'll just say, like, this is why people are afraid of online dating.
yeah, I think that's a pretty fair fair statement.
Like, your date may text while you're at a movie.
Mm-hmm.
That was a reversal, David, because you thought I was going to say that they might sue you.
Yeah.
But no, I would say that the suing is worse than the texting.
Probably,
for sure.
probably. According to him, he said she activated her phone at least 10 to 20 times in 15 minutes to read and send text messages.
That is pretty annoying, but I don't know if I'd sue somebody over it. I hate it when people do that. She says, "Oh my God, this is crazy," said 35-year-old who requested that her name not be used.
Yeah. She said, "Oh yeah, this is what I wanted to get to." She told the Statesman, which was the local paper, that she only texted on her phone 2 or 3 times. She says, "I had my phone low and I wasn't bothering anybody." She said,
Really? I mean, why can't she just say, "Yeah, I was texting people"? That's not something you should sue somebody over.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Her complaint seems to be,
like, honestly, the fact that she's making excuses here makes me a lot more sympathetic to the plaintiff.
It is.
Like, no, it's annoying when you text people during movies. Everybody hates it.
It is interesting, yeah, that rather than be like, this is a completely absurd thing he's doing, she's like, I wasn't texting that much.
Yeah, what I was doing was fine, and he should have been fine with it. Seriously? I mean, your first impulse is to make excuse. Okay.
So,
getting too invested
anyway,
in this.
it is interesting because, and she says that he was making her feel uncomfortable even before any of this went down, which, based on the fact that he's bringing the suit, that seems plausible to me. Obviously I wasn't there and can't.
That seems right.
Comment.
I buy that.
Neither of them. Yeah, you're right though. Neither of them come out looking great in this situation, but I have to say I don't really think it's a good use of the court's time to
Well, it's probably a small claims court. In fact, almost certainly small claims court, which means no attorneys are allowed. And they usually get through their calendar pretty quickly. But yeah, that's kind of a waste of judicial resources, I'd say.
Anyway, that's all I had on that one. There is a reason.
I don't know what his theory. I don't know what his theory is. Like, I don't know what he was deprived of. Whether or not it's a valid case. It's certainly an absurd case to bring. But whether or not there's any merit,
I think you're probably right.
I can't really answer.
Reading between the lines, because I don't think he has any idea how to express it appropriately either. But reading between the lines, I think he probably is saying there's an implied contract that I've purchased this for you. You owe me, at least your attention during this time.
Yeah, see, I would say that attention is not something that is paid to the person that bought you a ticket. I don't think that is a benefit to the obligee. I don't think that's consideration. There's no contract there. I would say that the ticket was a gratuitous gift. He doesn't have any legal recourse. He shouldn't be bringing this.
Yeah, and that's another thing she said. I'm not sure if you caught that. It was right down at the end of the article. She said he first just texted her and said pay me back for it, and she was like, no, you.
Oh, tried to settle it out of court.
That's you bought me the ticket. I don't owe you anything.
I'm inclined to agree with her on that, unless he was very explicit in his language in giving it. But even then, I don't think there's any consideration. I don't think he derives any benefit, at least no contractually valid benefit.
Yeah, that sounds right. I won't pretend that I know, but I'll buy what you're selling on that.
All right, well, that's all for this week's folks. Thank you for listening to Captain Kangaroo Court. We hope that you do join us again next week for the weird, wacky, and wonderful world of Captain Kangaroo Court.
All right, and we hope that you'll also stick around for our best segment, which is our end of episode disclaimers.
All right, thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see you all again a couple weeks from now. We'll let you know the topic on our social media on Facebook when we have decided what it will be. We don't have that yet, so that's something you'll have to look forward to.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.
Please note that nothing in this podcast constitutes legal advice, and all of the opinions expressed are the opinions of the individuals expressing them, not necessarily the opinions of the Lex Rex Institute.
The Lex Rex Institute is a nonprofit constitutional advocacy organization. If you'd like to learn a bit more about our organization's activities or make a donation, please visit our website, www.lexrex.org, LEXREX.org.
As a reminder, this podcast is a legal issues podcast, not a political issues podcast. We try to keep our commentary strictly to legal issues. Today, now that more issues are considered political than ever before, we believe it's especially important to distinguish between the two.
Thanks for listening to the Lex Rex Institute podcast, and we'll see you again next week.